southern side of Bull Run Creek, jubilant rebels celebrated their victory and rounded up Union prisoners. Jefferson Davis himself had turned up at the moment of victory. A warrior at heart, Davis could not sit in Richmond while the battle raged 80 miles away. He chartered a special train, obtained a horse near Manassas, and rode with an aide to the sound of the fighting. Elated, Davis urged vigorous pursuit of the beaten enemy. Although some Confederate units had gone a mile or two beyond Bull Run, Generals Johnston and Beauregard believed that no full-scale pursuit was possible. In Johnston's words,
"Our army was more disorganized by victory than that of the United States by defeat."
When the magnitude of Confederate victory sank in during the following weeks, Southern newspapers began to seek scapegoats for the failure to follow up victory and take Washington. An unseemly row burst out in which the partisans of each of the principals, President Davis and Generals Johnston and Beauregard, blamed each other for this failure. But the prospect of taking Washington was an illusion. McDowell formed a defensive line of unbloodied reserves at Centerville while the exhausted Confederates waited for ammunition and food. Early on the morning of July 21st, heavy rain began to turn the roads into soup. Despite a mood of panic in Washington, the rebels were not coming and could not have come. Though shaken by the news from Bull Run, President Lincoln and General Winfield Scott did not panic. They worked through the night to salvage some order from the chaos of defeat. The next day, Lincoln signed a bill for the enlistment of 500,000 three-year men. Volunteers answered the call and thronged to recruiting offices during the next few weeks. 2 days after Bull Run, Lincoln penned a memorandum on future Union strategy. Maryland was to be held with a gentle but firm and certain hand. Union troops in Virginia were to be reinforced, thoroughly trained, and prepared for a new invasion. But most importantly, all efforts were to be made to blockade the South and strangle her into submission. On February 6, 1861, a short, thin, red-headed captain of infantry reported for duty with an understrength company of troops at the St. Louis, Missouri arsenal. He was 42-year-old Nathaniel Lyon, one of the few confirmed abolitionists in the Union Army. Not long after his arrival in St. Louis, Lyon set forces in motion which would make inevitable the second great battle of the Civil War. At the beginning of the war, Missouri declared that it would be an armed neutral in the conflict and not send materials or men to either side. The neutrality was put to its first test on May 10, 1861. Union troops and Home Guards under Captain Nathaniel Lyon fired on a crowd of rioting bystanders as he paraded captured Missouri militia. He feared that they were trying to capture the St. Louis arsenal. The incident became known as the St. Louis Massacre. A day later, the Missouri General Assembly created the Missouri State Guard to defend the state from attacks from perceived enemies, either from the north or south. Governor Claiborne F. Jackson, who privately favored joining the Southern cause, appointed Sterling Price to be its general. Fearing Missouri's tilt to the south, William S. Harney, the federal commander in Missouri, struck the Price-Harney truce on May 12, 1861, which affirmed Missouri's neutrality in the conflict. Governor Jackson declared his support for the Union. However, Harney was replaced by Lyon, who was promoted to general, and Abraham Lincoln made a specific request for Missouri troops to enter federal service. Jackson withdrew his support. On June 12, 1861, Lyon and Jackson met in St. Louis to resolve the matter. The meeting ended with Lyon saying,
"This means war. In an hour, one of my officers will call for you and conduct you out of my lines." Nathaniel Lyon, June 12, 1861.
Lyon pursued Jackson and Price and the official state government across Missouri in skirmishes such as the Battle of Boonville on June 17th, followed by the Battle of Carthage on July 5th, 1861. After Lyon captured the state capital at Jefferson City, a special convention was called to decide on secession, a meeting that ended with Missouri staying in the Union. On July 27th, the convention declared the governor's office vacant and then selected Hamilton Rowan Gamble to be the new governor. By July 13, 1861, Lyon's army was encamped at the city of Springfield, Missouri, and consisted of approximately 6,000 men and 3 batteries of artillery. By the end of July 1861, the Missouri State Guard was camped about 75 miles southwest of Springfield and had been reinforced by Confederate Brigadier Generals Benjamin McCulloch and N. Bart Pierce. This made the Missourian force over 12,000 strong. They developed plans to attack Springfield, but General Lyon marched out of the city on August 1st in an attempt to surprise the Southern forces. The Army's vanguards skirmished at Doug Springs on August 7th. The Union force emerged as the victor, but Lyon learned he was outnumbered more than 2-1 and retreated back to Springfield. McCulloch, now in command of the Missourian Army, gave chase. By August 6th, his force was encamped at Wilson's Creek, 10 miles southwest of the city. Outnumbered, Lyon planned to withdraw to Rolla in the north to reinforce and resupply, but not before launching a surprise attack on the Missourian camp to delay pursuit. Colonel Franz Sigel, Lyon's second-in-command, developed an aggressive strategy to split the Union force and strike McCulloch in a pincer movement. He proposed to lead 1,200 men in a flanking maneuver while the main body under Lyon struck from the north. Lyon approved, and the Union Army marched out of Springfield on the rainy night of August 9th. This left about 1,000 men to protect supplies and cover the retreat. The success of the stratagem was dependent on the element of surprise. McCulloch was also planning a surprise attack on the city, but the rain caused him to cancel his plan. At about 5 a.m. at first light on the morning of August 10th, the Union force attacked. Missourians were caught by surprise. Lyon's force overran the enemy camps and took the high ground at the crest of a ridge which would become known as Bloody Hill. Early Union hopes for a rout were dashed, however, when the artillery of the Pulaski, Arkansas battery unlimbered and checked the advance. This gave Price's infantry time and cover to organize lines on the south slope of the hill. Sigel's plan was initially successful. His flank routed the Missouri cavalry, but collapsed when McCulloch's force counterattacked at the Sharp Farm. Uniforms had not yet been standardized this early in the war, and McCulloch's men were wearing uniforms similar to Sigel's. The Union soldiers believed McCulloch's approaching lines were Union reinforcements and did not recognize them as the enemy until it was too late. The flank was utterly devastated by the counterattack, and Sigel and his men fled the field. With the rout of Sigel's flank, the momentum of the battle shifted in the Missourians' favor. Lyon, already shot twice, became the first Union general to be killed in the war. Major Samuel D. Sturgis assumed command of the Union Army. Although still in a defensible position atop the hill, Union supplies were low, and morale was worsening. By 11 a.m., the Union forces had already repulsed 3 separate Confederate charges. Ammunition and men were nearly exhausted, and Sturgis retreated rather than risk a 4th Confederate attack. The casualties were about equal on both sides, with 1,317 Union and 1,230 Missouri. Though the Missourians won the field, they were unable to pursue the retreating Union forces to Rolla. With the victory, Price's Missouri Guard began an invasion of northern Missouri that culminated in the Battle of Liberty on September 17, 1861. As far as the war in the West was concerned, Wilson's Creek changed almost nothing. In or out of the Union, Missouri was doomed to suffer 4 years of guerrilla fighting. Many of those who would be involved in the border terror, men such as William Quantrill, Frank James, Cole Younger, and Wild Bill Hickok, were there at Wilson's Creek. The longest-running campaign of the Civil War was the Union siege of Confederate ports. Much of the fighting was naval. Federal ships hurled shot and shell at the rebel shore batteries. Fighting on land, Union troops were put ashore in large, risky amphibious operations that often brought the soldiers face to face in desperate close-quarters combat. The Confederates fought back not only with shot and shell, but also with every new weapon they could conceive. These included everything from iron-prowed rams to electrically detonated underwater mines, and even the world's first successful attack submarine. In the fight to close the Confederate water lifeline, neither side would back away, no matter the cost. The Union determination was all part of the grand strategy for victory laid out by General Winfield Scott, U.S. Army commander. Scott's Anaconda Plan called for U.S. forces to squeeze the Confederacy as if it were caught in the coils of a giant snake. This would be done by gaining control of the Mississippi River in the west, while blockading or seizing the main southern ports along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts. Closing the ports was essential to the plan. The South lacked the heavy industry of the North. In order to wage a modern war, the Confederate States of America needed to trade cotton for weapons with Europe. Choking off this trade was the single most important mission of the Union Navy. In the war's first months, the Union Navy consisted of 42 ships and 9,000 officers and men. By the fall of 1861, the Navy had almost tripled its manpower and grown to 264 ships. Many were merchant ships, coastal vessels, and ferries which were converted to gunboats. There was no Confederate Navy to speak of, aside from a few gunboats and revenue cutters seized at the beginning of the war. If the U.S. Navy did not have to worry about any significant seagoing foe, it still faced a monumental task of patrolling 3,500 miles of coastline from the Chesapeake Bay to the Rio Grande. Gideon Welles, President Abraham Lincoln's Navy Secretary, devised a strategy to seize the more vulnerable southern ports and close them for good. This would also allow the Union Navy to use them as bases along the southern coast to recoal and resupply. They could then stay on station longer. The first test of this plan was along the Carolina coast and the seizure of Hilton Head Island. A fleet under the aristocratic Samuel DuPont and an army under General Thomas Sherman became the first Union force to take possession of rebel soil in the Deep South. Alarmed by the Union advance, President Jefferson Davis dispatched his military advisor, an unproven general named Robert Edward Lee, to bring some order to the Confederate defenses. Lee pulled back batteries along the coast that would be easily defeated on the outer barrier islands and relocated them along the rivers and creeks that led to the interior. Next, he organized a small mobile force that could move up or down the rail line to concentrate on any point the Union forces might land. At the same time, he reinforced the harbor defenses at Savannah and Charleston. Even with these improvements by Lee, the southern forts would have been lost if a daring Union commander had followed up the fall of Hilton Head. Fortunately for the rebels, daring was one thing the North was in short supply of in 1861.
General Sherman had won no great success on the southern coast. In cooperation with the Navy, he took possession of all the islands and held the approaches to all available harbors south of Charleston. Charleston was what we wanted, and I thought when we landed on Hilton Head that the men we had could have marched to Charleston. I suppose General Sherman thought so and never doubted he would have been in Charleston before Christmas 1861 if his superiors at the head of the Army of the Potomac or at the War Office had consented. Colonel Edwin Metcalf, 3rd Rhode Island Infantry.
In spite of the increased coverage of the southern harbors by the Union Navy, rebel ships continued to evade the Federal blockade with relative ease. In 1861, 9 out of 10 incoming blockade runners reached port safely. These daring efforts were growing more numerous and sophisticated. By late 1861, Confederate British combines had acquired a variety of armed merchant ships. Eventually, they would launch long, low steam-powered blockade runners that could outrun the Federal frigates and gunboats. The blockade runners would load up with nearly 1,000 bales of cotton and slip past the Federal pickets and speed for the port of St. George on Bermuda or the Bahamas. Once safe in the neutral port, they would offload their cargo for transportation under a European flag to Liverpool. In exchange, they would load up with muskets, cannon, and other supplies needed in the South. In 1 month in 1863, Southern ships unloaded a total of 110,000 British and Austrian rifles, 21,000 British muskets, and 129 cannon from Bermuda alone. The Federal commanders were eager to find a way to cut back that traffic. In the end, the only way to end the flow of goods at sea was to win on land. The Union catastrophe at Manassas was the end of Irvin McDowell's tenure in command of the Federal Army. Within a week of the humiliating defeat, Lincoln installed Major General George B. McClellan, the hero of the West Virginia campaign, to command the military division of the Potomac. In a letter to his wife, McClellan wrote,
"By some strange operation of magic, I seem to have become the power of the land. I almost think that were I to win some small success now, I could become dictator or anything else that might please me. But nothing of that kind would please me. Therefore, I won't be dictator. George McClellan."
But the young Napoleon did not think he had enough power.
"I am here in a terrible place. The enemy has from 3 to 4 times my force. The president is an idiot. The old general is in his dotage. They cannot, nor will not, see the true state of affairs."
George B. McClellan was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania on December 3, 1826. He was the third of 5 children born to Dr. George and Elizabeth McClellan. His family moved within the upper ranks of Philadelphia society. Young George entered school at the age of 5. He attended private schools and a prep school before entering the military academy at West Point in 1842. At the age of 15, he was the youngest of the West Point arrivals that year to seek a place as fourth-classman. In 1846, he had earned the distinction of graduating second in his class of 59. The class of 46 contributed 20 generals to the Union and Confederate armies. Upon graduation, George McClellan was appointed second lieutenant in the Corps of Engineers. In the Mexican War, he won brevets of first lieutenant and captain for his zeal, gallantry, and ability in constructing roads and bridges over routes for the marching army. After the war, he became an instructor at West Point for 3 years. McClellan's other accomplishments included surveying possible transcontinental railroad routes. As a member of a board of officers, he was sent abroad to study the armies of Europe and observe the Crimean War. This resulted in the development of the McClellan saddle, which was standard equipment in the Army until mechanization eliminated horses in 1942. In 1857, he resigned his commission of captain in the 1st Cavalry to become chief engineer of the Illinois Central Railroad, where he occasionally worked with a lawyer named Abraham Lincoln. When the Civil War began, he was living in Ohio, where he served as president of the Ohio and Mississippi Railroad. His heart was captured by a young lady named Ellen Marcy. Ellen had received numerous marriage proposals, but was strongly encouraged by her father to accept McClellan's. On May 22, 1861, they were married in New York. George McClellan had proved himself to be an efficient organizer with strong personal magnetism. For this reason, and some successes in West Virginia, President Lincoln approved him as Major General in the regular army. He was outranked only by General-in-Chief Winfield Scott. In spite of his overinflated sense of self-importance, McClellan's talent as an organizer was just what the Green Army of the Potomac needed. He brought order out of chaos, got a training program underway, improved the distribution of supplies, and organized a staff to support the Army in everything from bakeries to post offices. Through the waning days of summer and the first crisp days of fall, the Federal troops marched and countermarched at drill among the sands of the Potomac. Fresh regiments arrived daily, parading behind their bands with standards flying. Trainloads of freshly cast cannon rumbled in from the north. The young general rode among the tents, alert and gallant. His keen eyes missed nothing, either for praise or blame. In the evening, McClellan would be in conference with some mysterious and raffish operative of the Pinkerton service, back from a secret mission within the enemy's lines. They brought in disquieting reports of a growing Southern host just across the river. The Union general believed even the most inflated reports of 100, 200, or even 300,000 rebel soldiers waiting to storm the capital at any moment. The Confederates were more than happy to participate in this quiet period. They may have achieved a victory at Bull Run, but the Southern commanders knew it was a near thing that was more a matter of luck than military might. Their men and officers needed training, and their supply system was in shambles. Worse yet, they had to equip these new troops without the industrial base of the North. By October, Joe Johnston had been named commander of all Southern forces in Virginia after the talkative Beauregard crossed the Confederate president. He immediately entrenched his forces on a long line, with the Potomac on both flanks and the center at Centerville. This effectively closed the river to Union shipping. On the northern side of the river, General-in-Chief Winfield Scott refused to believe the ever-alarming Pinkerton reports. Being at the center of events brought out the worst parts of McClellan's character. He was bolder on paper than in the real world when showing his displeasure. Disgusted with both the old general and the civilian government, he wrote, "There are some of the greatest geese in the cabinet I have ever seen." Matters finally came to a head when Scott, fed up with the infighting, resigned. He went into retirement for the good of the country he had served so faithfully since the War of 1812. McClellan thought that a great weight was lifted off his shoulders when Scott left, but within a week, the wait was back. Lincoln now had the "we must advance on Richmond" fever. While the troops drilled on the dead leaves of November and the bugle calls of an idle army filled the air of the capital city, the general still argued against advancing south. He also made a point of insulting the president at every opportunity. Coming home from reviewing his troops one evening, his orderly informed the general that the president had been waiting in the parlor for him for over an hour. He sent word down that he was busy and went to bed. Lincoln waited another hour, then left. When asked why he tolerated such an insult, Lincoln replied, "I will hold his horse if he would give us a victory." By the new year, so little had happened in the East that the newspapers could sum up the events for their readers with the phrase, "all quiet on the Potomac." It became an accusation of inactivity, as well as a report of events. It would not be until spring before that headline would change. Abraham Lincoln viewed Kentucky as one of the keys to victory for the Union.
I think to lose Kentucky is nearly to lose the whole game. Kentucky gone, we cannot hold Missouri. Nor, as I think, Maryland. These all against us, the job on our hands is too large for us. We would as well consent to separation at once, including the surrender of this capital.
In the fall of 1861, the armed contest for Kentucky had begun. After the Bluegrass State Legislature voted to remain loyal to the Union, Jefferson Davis wasted no time in moving to secure Kentucky. He sent General Felix Zollicoffer from eastern Tennessee into Kentucky to guard the Cumberland Gap. Zollicoffer's brigade quickly took the initiative and brushed aside Union militia at Barberville and Laurel Bridge near London, Kentucky. In October, the gray tide overreached its grasp and was forced to withdraw after encountering Union troops at Wildcat Mountain. After Wildcat Mountain, Zollicoffer's men retreated back to Tennessee, but they did not remain there long. When the expected Union pursuit failed to materialize, Zollicoffer moved back into the Commonwealth. In a letter to his superiors from his camp along the Cumberland River, Zollicoffer wrote,
"The river protects our rear and flanks. The position I occupy north of the river is a fine base for operations in front. It is a much stronger natural position for defense than on the south bank. I think it should be held at all hazards, but I ought to have a stronger force. Felix Zollicoffer, December 10th, 1861.
As Zollicoffer settled into winter quarters, federal authorities became concerned that this position would become a base of operations for a spring offensive to seize the state of Kentucky and control the Ohio River. To counter this, Brigadier General George Thomas was ordered to drive the rebels across the Cumberland River and break up the main Confederate Army under the command of Major General George B. Crittenden. Thomas left Lebanon with 8,000 men, headed for Logan's Crossroads, which was 9 miles north of Mill Springs. There he waited for Brigadier General Albin Shep's troops from Somerset to join him. The march was slow, as the blue-clad throng, soaked by winter rains, trudged through ankle-deep mud. As Thomas made his way south, Zollicoffer met with his commanding officer, General George Bibb Crittenden, who arrived to take field command of the army that now numbered 6,500 men. Crittenden and Zollicoffer believed they had an opportunity to give General Thomas a warm welcome at the end of his journey. The Confederate generals were certain that General Shep's forces at Somerset could not cross the rain-swollen Fishing Creek to aid Thomas at Logan's Crossroads if they attacked the Union Army there. The plan had some merit, if the rebels struck swiftly and with great force. Though Shep was less than 10 miles away, the rising waters at Fishing Creek presented a formidable barrier. But plans are only as good as the information they are based upon, and this plan lacked one important piece of information. Shep was in the process of doing the impossible. By January 18, 1862, Shep had his main force across the creek in good order.
The crossing of Fishing Creek by our forces was one of the grandest and most imposing sights that I have ever witnessed. To see 3,000 or 4,000 men plunging into a deep, rapid stream of water in order to come to the support of our national flag is truly commendable. Chaplain Lemuel Drake, 31st Ohio Infantry.
Shep's bold crossing of Fishing Creek finally united the Union forces. During the evening hours of January 18th, as Shep's men were linking up with Thomas, the Confederate Army left their winter huts and moved on the Union Army at Logan's Crossing. It was less than 10 miles from the rebel camp at Beech Grove to Logan's Crossroads, but the night march would take Crittenden's men 6 hours. The weather would not only take its toll on the men, but also on the weapons they carried.
The night was very cold and it had been raining, sleeting, or snowing all night. Our old flintlock muskets were wet and water-soaked. Our regiment spent about 10 minutes trying to dry them out and be ready for the fray. Lieutenant Spencer Talley, 28th Tennessee Infantry.
Near daybreak, on a dank Sunday, lead elements of the Confederate Army encountered Union pickets on the Mill Spring Road, near a small stream known as Timmy's Branch. As a heated skirmish began to rage in the first light of day, a lone horseman dashed back to the Union camp to spread the alarm. Colonel Malin Manson was the first to answer the call.
The picket companies, having rallied, held the enemy in check until a courier arrived at my quarters with information that the enemy were advancing with a very large force. It caused the long roll to be beaten. The 10th Indiana Regiment was quickly formed, and I ordered them to the support of the pickets.
The gray lines pressing the stubborn pickets were rudely met by a volley from the onrushing 10th Indiana. This sharp exchange in the growing light put an end to any hope of surprising the exhausted Union Army. The Federal command was now alert to the danger and started feeding fresh troops into the fight. The Battle of Mill Springs became a melee, with two major disjointed engagements dominating the field. As the 10th Indiana continued to make it hot for the boys in gray, the 15th Mississippi began to deploy on the west side of the road. Once there, they poured a volley into the Yankee ranks. They then adjusted their line of battle to the east side of the road. The early morning fog and increasing smoke of battle seemed to swallow the Confederate soldiers as they tried to redeploy in a wooded ravine thick with underbrush. The ravine covered the Confederate movements, but it also cut them off from the battle and gave the Union soldiers time to regroup. The Union troops began to fire volley after volley into the mist and the unseen enemy.
Balls began passing over our heads pretty fast with zip, zip, but they did not seem to be doing any harm, for they were 200 yards away on the hill above us. William Worsham, 19th Tennessee.
During a lull in the battle, Union Colonel Speed Fry of the 4th Kentucky ordered his men to withdraw to a split-rail fence in their rear. At that moment, a lone officer rode out of the fog and ordered Fry to cease firing. "You must not fire on our own men," said the officer. "I would not do so intentionally," answered Fry, as the two soldiers passed close enough to touch. Fry then rode toward his men and ordered them to stop firing. At that moment, a Confederate officer galloped into view, shouting at the top of his lungs, "General, they are the enemy!" This officer was Zollicoffer's aide, Captain Henry Fogg, and the lone officer who had preceded him was the unfortunate Zollicoffer. General Zollicoffer, leading his brigade of the 19th Tennessee Infantry from the front, was sure that his men were receiving fire from the missing boys of the 15th Mississippi that were supposed to be on his right flank. Fry later wrote about what happened next.
As soon as I reached my regiment, I paused, turning my horse a little to the left, when to my great surprise, another officer, whom I had not seen, rode out from behind a large tree and, with pistol in hand, leveled it directly at me, fired. I immediately drew my Colt's revolver from the holster and fired. General Zollicoffer fell pierced by 3 bullets, for at the same moment several men of the 4th Kentucky fired upon him.
Unaware that their commander lay dead in front of the Union lines, the Confederate regiments on the west side of the road finally sorted themselves out and formed into a line of battle. The 15th Mississippi charged out of the ravine with a tremendous roar and pounded the blue line.
Our boys soon drove them back to the main line and then advanced by firing, running 10 steps, loading, then firing before rising up again to fire. This was kept up until the entire 10th Indiana Regiment was driven from the field by our brave Grenada and Duck Hill boys. James R. Benford, 15th Mississippi.
As the 10th Indiana fell back, fresh Union forces entered the battle to blunt the assault. The Union soldiers fought like fiends to hold the ground at the rail fence. They slowly forced the Mississippians to give ground. Suddenly, the Confederate 20th Tennessee came to their aid, but their wet flints and damp powder proved their undoing.
With a shout that would have warmed an Egyptian mummy, we rushed up to the 15th Mississippi with only a fence between us and the enemy. We did the best we could with our old flintlocks. Mine went off once in the action. Although I wiped the pan and primed a dozen times, it would do so no more. James Cooper, 20th Tennessee.
The weight of the concentrated Union firepower began to tell. Momentum of the battle swung in the Union direction. The 15th Mississippi made another valiant attempt at sweeping the blue line. Surging again from the ravine, desperate to end the agony of the struggle, they slammed into the fence with all their fury.
Our entire line put their guns through the cracks of the fence and fired a volley of ball and buckshot. The screams and groans, officers cursing and begging, trying to rally their men, filled the air. I shall never forget the scene. It almost makes my blood run cold to think of it. James Benford, 15th Mississippi.
The 2nd Minnesota quickly made their presence felt, hitting the fence with the fury of a tornado.
We were so close on them that one of the men had his beard and whiskers singed by the fire of one of the muskets. Another caught hold of one of their muskets and jerked it through the fence. 2 other boys stood and fired at each other at a range so close that their musket barrels crossed. Both fell dead. Colonel Horatio P. Van Cleve, 2nd Minnesota.
The weight of the Minnesota assault proved too much for the bone-weary Confederates. The 20th Tennessee Regiment, armed with flintlocks older than the men carrying them, grew panicky as their weapons continued to misfire. The 2nd Minnesota forced the Confederates back toward the ravine where the Mississippians had taken refuge. One Mississippi soldier recalled,
"My God," I said to Colonel Walthall, "we're not whipped, are we?" Smiling at my remark, he pointed to the rear and said, "Look there." I looked for the first time directly in our rear and saw, occupying the position we'd first held and where our horses were hitched, a large regiment of what seemed to me the largest men and wearing the bluest clothes I ever saw. I asked the colonel, what were we to do? And he said, "Get away as fast as you can." James R. Benford, 15th Mississippi.
The butcher's bill had been paid along the rail fence, but on the left, blood was still flowing. The 9th Ohio Regiment was perhaps the best trained regiment on the field that tragic day. Most of the men were veterans of European wars, and they fought like a machine. As the fight on the east ground to a halt, 8 companies of the Ohio Regiment rushed through a stand of thick woods that bordered the road. There, they came under fire of the waiting Confederates.
The enemy was posted in force on the edge of and in the woods opposite us, separated by 2 cornfields. Robert McCook, 9th Ohio.
McCook ordered his German Buckeyes to fix bayonets and without hesitation gave the command to charge. The company commanders wheeled their men into line with parade ground precision and flung them at their foe on the double quick.
"If it gets too hot for you, shut your eyes, my boys. Forward!" Major Gustav Kammerling, 9th Ohio.
The disciplined Germans executed the maneuver by the book, crushing the Confederate left, and in turn placing unbearable pressure on the right.
The enemy again reinforced their right and began a flank movement that forced the entire left wing over the top of a ridge. We were unable to check the advancing foe. The whole line now gave way and left the field in wild confusion and disorder. William Worsham, 19th Tennessee.
The battered Tennesseans were done for this day. Their weapons were useless. It was suicide for them to face the relentless fire of the better-armed Yankees. By 10 a.m., after some 4 hours of hard fighting on a dark, rainy morning, the battle was over. The broken and bloody rebels did not halt their retreat until they reached the fortifications of Beech Grove. The Battle of Mill Springs was a decisive victory for the Union Army, the first important Union victory in the Western Theater, and the beginning of a long line of Confederate setbacks in the area.
I'll place my knapsack on my back, my rifle on my shoulder. I'll march away to the firing line and kill that Yankee soldier. I'll kill that Yankee soldier. I'll march away to the firing line and kill that Yankee soldier. I'll bid farewell to my wife and child, farewell to my aged mother. I'll go and join in the bloody strife till this cruel war is over, till this cruel war is over. I'll go and join in the bloody strife till this cruel war is over. If I am shot on the battlefield, then I should not recover. Oh, who will protect my wife and child? Care for my aged mother? Who'll care for my aged mother? Oh, who will protect my wife and child and care for my aged mother? And if our southern cause is lost and southern rights denied us, we'll be ground beneath